When we think of 18th century Britain, we kind of picture these grand halls of parliament, maybe the beginnings of modern politics. But what if I told you that picture is, well, mostly a facade? In this explainer, we're going to pull back the curtain on a system that was a long way from the democracy you might be imagining. And that's really the big question, isn't it? On the surface, sure, Britain had a parliament. It had a king, it had lords, it had the commons. But underneath all that official stuff, a totally different power game was being played. So who was really calling the shots? To get to the bottom of this, we've got to start with the official blueprint. How was this whole system supposed to work, at least on paper? So in theory, the British political system was this neat little triangle of power. You had the monarch, you had the hereditary aristocrats over in the House of Lords, and then you had the House of Commons, which was supposedly elected. It looks like a classic system of checks and balances, but looks can be seriously deceiving.
Okay, so let's take a closer look at the key players in this political drama and what their jobs were actually meant to be.
So here are the main pillars, right? The king, who held the executive power. He got to pick the ministers to run the government. Then you had the House of Lords, which was basically made up of the country's richest landowners who just inherited their seats. And finally, the House of Commons, filled with members who were in principle elected to represent the people. Seems simple enough. And here, this is where we see this massive gap between the idea and the reality. Yeah, sure, the Commons could propose taxes, but a lot of its members were completely dependent on rich patrons just to have their seats. Their actual influence was pretty minimal. The real powerhouse was the House of Lords. These unelected peers could literally veto any law they didn't like, and crucially, they often controlled who even got elected to the Commons to begin with. And hey, let's not forget the monarch. The king was not just a figurehead. He had the very real power to hire and fire the entire government. And kings like George III, they weren't shy about using it either. He actively worked to claw back control from powerful political groups, proving the crown was still a huge player in day-to-day politics.
So if the official rulebook was more of a guideline, what were the real rules of the game? Let's break down how this whole system actually worked behind the scenes.
This right here is the absolute key. Forget about ideology or policy or public service. The true currency of power was patronage. It was all about who you knew, how much land you owned, and which powerful family you belonged to. Alliances were built on personal connections and financial favors, not political beliefs. Even the so-called political parties, the Whigs and the Tories, weren't parties like we think of them today. You could say the Whigs were loosely tied to new money and business, and the Tories to the old landed families. But really, they are more like rival factions of the exact same tiny elite, basically competing for power through their social networks. Okay, now let's get to the very foundation of any democracy, the vote. How did people actually cast their ballots? And more importantly, who even got to do so? The answer is, well, it's complicated and deeply, deeply corrupt. I mean, the franchise was just incredibly exclusive. The vast, vast majority of the population was completely shut out. To even have a chance to vote, you had to be a man and you had to own a pretty significant amount of property. This wasn't a system for the people. It was a system for a privileged few. And this whole absurdity is perfectly captured by this idea of rotten boroughs. These were parliamentary districts with only a handful of voters, sometimes literally just one family. So a wealthy lord could just buy up the land, control the parliamentary seat, and send whoever he wanted to London. It was a total sham. So get this, not only was voting corrupt, with bribery and threats being totally normal, but the entire map of representation was basically frozen in time. As the Industrial Revolution started creating these huge new cities like Manchester and Birmingham, these booming centers of population had 0 members of parliament. 0. Meanwhile, some empty field with a few voters, that rotten borough could be sending 2 MPs to Westminster. It's just wild. So, when you put all these pieces together, the all-powerful lords, the influential king, the networks of patronage, this insane electoral system, what do you actually get? Well, this system was fundamentally broken in 3 core ways. First, representation was a joke, with huge chunks of the country just completely ignored. Second, corruption wasn't a problem in the system, it was the system. And third, the right to vote itself was designed from the ground up to exclude almost everybody. At the end of the day, this wasn't a good system that had just gone wrong. No. It was a system working exactly as it was designed to keep power concentrated in the hands of a very small, very rich, and very interconnected aristocratic class. It was a government of the elite, by the elite, and for the elite. Period. And that really leaves us with one final big question. With all these new ideas about rights and democracy starting to bubble up, and these massive new industrial cities rising without any voice, how long could a system this unbalanced, this corrupt, and this exclusive possibly hold on? The pressure for change was building, and you just know a storm was on the horizon.